The friendship that ruined my life. My friend destroyed my life. It all started quite innocently. Rob and I had been friends since school, and I always considered him a reliable person. He was the life of the party, the one who could always lift spirits when things were going downhill. I truly believed that I had a real friend I could rely on in tough times. We had been through so much together that the idea that Rob could harm me never even crossed my mind. But over time, it became clear that some people can ruin your life without even realizing it, or worse, by consciously manipulating you for their own purposes. After school, we didn't lose touch, even though life gradually started pulling us in different directions. I met my future wife, Mary, and built a career at a company that seemed to hold great promise for me. Rob, on the other hand, stayed in our hometown, worked various temporary jobs, and always seemed a bit more carefree than me. But I never thought this could affect our friendship. When I married Mary, I didn't hesitate for a second to ask Rob to be my best man. He had been such a big part of my life for so long that it would have felt strange to imagine that day without him. But over time, everything changed. I didn't notice it at first, but strange problems started creeping into my life after every meeting with Rob. When he moved closer to us, my relationship with Mary started gradually deteriorating. At first, these were small conflicts. She hinted that Rob had too much influence over my decisions. I defended him, not realizing that his presence was slowly destroying my peace and stability. Every time I turned to Rob for advice, he seemed to support me, but somehow always nudged me toward risky or questionable decisions. My job, which once brought me satisfaction, became a real struggle. Several projects I took on with confidence ended up failing. And you know what the worst part is? Rob often encouraged me to take on those projects, assuring me they would lead to success. "You can't miss this opportunity," he'd say with a smile. But whenever something went wrong, he'd just shrug and say, "Well, that's life. Don't worry about it." But I did worry. Losing trust at work, I felt my confidence slowly slipping away. Mary noticed that I had changed. She often tried to talk to me, asking what was going on, why I had become irritable and withdrawn. But I couldn't find the answers to those questions. I was sure I was doing everything right. I just wasn't lucky. But the more I dug into my problems, the deeper I sank into despair. Rob was there, but instead of supporting me, his advice often led to even worse outcomes. Gradually, doubts started creeping into my mind. Was Rob really the friend I thought he was? Why, despite all his support, was my life only getting worse? I tried to push those thoughts away because it was hard to admit that the person you've trusted your entire life could be part of your problems. Maybe I was to blame for my failures. Maybe it was just a rough patch. But with each passing day, those doubts only grew stronger. One day at work, I landed a major contract that was supposed to elevate me to the next level. This was my chance to prove that I was still capable of more. I trusted Rob, who told me that I should take on this project despite some risks. Big moves require big decisions, he said at the time. But everything went wrong. The deal fell through, I lost the company's money, and my reputation took a serious hit. I felt like the whole world was crashing down on me. This failure was the last straw. My relationship with Mary became even more strained. She often asked why I couldn't say no to Rob, why I blindly followed his advice when it repeatedly led to negative outcomes. I couldn't answer. Rob was like an older brother to me, but at the same time, I started noticing how his words and actions gradually undermined my confidence. He didn't seem malicious or deceitful. It all looked as if he was trying to help, but every step he took made me feel like I was losing control over my own life. Over time, tension filled my home. Mary stopped talking to Rob and began avoiding his visits. She said his presence made her uncomfortable, but I stubbornly refused to acknowledge it. It became harder for me to see him as the same friend I had known since childhood. He was fun, open, and sincere, but behind this outward mask were things I couldn't fully understand. Despite all the red flags, I kept following his advice. Every time I felt I was losing control of a situation, Rob would show up with his tips. He had a way of finding the right words to convince me to act exactly how it suited him. And perhaps the most painful part was that, deep down, I agreed with Mary. I felt something was wrong, but I couldn't stop. It was like an addiction, constantly turning to Rob for solutions to my problems. With each passing day, my anxiety grew. I would wake up in the middle of the night thinking about how I had gotten to this point. Why, as an adult, couldn't I make decisions on my own? Why did every choice I made lead to new difficulties? And why, despite all these problems, did I continue to trust Rob? My inner world was shattered. On one hand, I didn't want to believe that my problem was my friend. On the other hand, I could see how his presence in my life was only harming me. My relationships with colleagues also began to deteriorate. People at work started noticing that I was nervous, losing focus, and making questionable decisions. A few times, I overheard them whispering behind my back, discussing my failures. This situation was destroying me from the inside. I wanted to be successful like I once was, but I felt weaker than ever. And each time I turned to Rob for help, he would only add fuel to the fire with his well-meaning advice. My self-esteem plummeted. What once seemed achievable now felt like an insurmountable obstacle. I started doubting my abilities, even with the simplest tasks. Whenever I thought about making a change, Rob's voice echoed in my head. Don't worry, it's just a temporary setback. But those setbacks became constant. I was stuck in a trap between my fears and my dependence on his opinion. Mary often told me that I had changed, that the optimistic and determined Jake she once knew had been replaced by a man who was depressed and lost. I knew she was right, but I couldn't figure out how to get out of this situation. Rob wasn't just a friend, he had become such a big part of my life that I couldn't imagine living without his advice, even if it was harmful to me. I was completely disoriented. One evening, after yet another argument with Mary, I sat alone in the dark in our living room. I could feel everything around me falling apart. I had lost myself, my ambitions, and even my ability to make decisions. It terrified me to admit that I no longer had control over my own life. And worst of all, I couldn't even understand how to fix it. In these moments of doubt and despair, I often found myself thinking that if Rob disappeared from my life, maybe everything would fall into place. But I couldn't bring myself to let go of this friendship. That would be a betrayal of everything I believed in for so many years. But the more I tried to justify my attachment to Rob, the deeper I sank into the quicksand of my own problems. I stopped trusting even myself. Every decision I made seemed wrong. I realized that I no longer recognized myself. Where was the ambitious, confident Jake who always knew what he wanted? Now, I felt like just a shadow of that person. It seemed like I was losing not just my life, but my very identity. Everything that once mattered to me was crumbling right before my eyes. Rob stayed by my side. He was always ready to lend a helping hand. But now I began to notice that his help always had some hidden motive. Maybe he didn't even realize what he was doing, or maybe it was all part of his game. I didn't know whom to trust. Every step I took felt more uncertain. I was trapped in a cage, made of my own fears and dependence on this friendship. Eventually, I started losing friends. Many of them turned away from me because they couldn't stand watching me ruin my life anymore. Tom, one of my longtime buddies, told me bluntly, "Jake, you're hurting yourself. You're not the person I used to know." I was shocked, but I couldn't disagree. Rob had changed me beyond recognition, and I didn't understand how it happened. At this point, I seriously started thinking about my future. Can I keep living like this? Would I be better off without Rob in my life? The answers were clear, but accepting them was incredibly difficult. I was caught in a vicious cycle. Every time I tried to break away from his advice, I'd come crawling back to it, like an addict needing another fix. Inside me, a real battle was raging. One part of me wanted to escape this chaos and regain control, while the other was terrified of losing what was left of our friendship. I no longer knew where to find answers. I felt like I wasn't capable of changing my life anymore. All my attempts to do things on my own only ended in failure. Mary started drifting further and further away from me. I could see the disappointment and exhaustion in her eyes. She wanted to see me happy and at peace. But instead, she got a man who had lost control of his life. I watched as this situation slowly consumed her, but I didn't know how to fix it. Each day became a new test for us. I felt our family slowly falling apart, but I couldn't stop it. At some point, I realized I couldn't go on like this anymore. I needed to make a decision, either break free from this vicious cycle or continue destroying myself. But how? How do you let go of something that's become a part of your life? These unanswered questions haunted me every day. I was on the verge of breaking down and didn't know how to find a way out. It's been a few years since I first started noticing changes in my life, but now all those problems have only deepened. My position at work has significantly worsened, and I constantly feel tension at home. It seems like everything that's happening is a result of the decisions I made under Rob's influence. He was always the one who pushed me to take risks, and I often blindly followed his advice. But now, looking back, I can see that each of those decisions only complicated my life. Rob was a master of persuasion, and I kept trusting him, even though my inner self was screaming that I needed to stop. My marriage also began to fall apart. Mary noticed that every time I interacted with Rob, I became more irritable and anxious. She sensed that his influence was harmful, but I couldn't believe that my best friend could be the source of all these problems. We started arguing more often, and most of these conflicts revolved around Rob. Mary openly expressed her dissatisfaction, but I remained loyal to my friend. This decision became a real test for me, as I was torn between loyalty to my friendship and the desire to save my family. One of the biggest mistakes I made at work happened because of a project I took on at Rob's urging. I was quite successful in my company and even up for a promotion. However, this project turned out to be a real challenge. Rob assured me that the risk was worth it, and I decided to give it a try. Instead of success, I ended up with complete failure. My boss, Carol, was disappointed with my actions and didn't hesitate to show it. She had warned me from the start that the project was too risky, but I insisted on going through with it. After the failure, I lost her trust and felt the distance between us growing. The conflict with Carol was just the beginning. Rumors started circulating in the team that I was no longer capable of handling my responsibilities. People stopped trusting me and participating in my initiatives. I felt like I was losing my footing. This was especially painful because I had once been one of the team leaders. Now I was an outcast, and every move I made was questioned. All of this led me to become even more dependent on Rob. He was the only one who still supported me, even as everything else was falling apart. But his support was like poison. He kept giving me advice that seemed reasonable, but every time I followed it, things got worse. He constantly said, "Don't worry, these are just temporary difficulties. You'll get through this." But these temporary difficulties had been going on for years, and I couldn't see an end. The deeper I sank into these problems, the more I realized that my life was gradually falling apart. I was losing control of everything, from my career to my personal relationships. Mary started drifting even further away from me. She tried to reach out to me, asking me to face the truth, but I stubbornly refused to admit that Rob could be the source of all this trouble. Her patience was wearing thin, and I could see our relationship growing colder. She started spending more time alone, seeking the company of friends, while I buried myself in my problems, looking for solace from the very friend who might have been the cause of my misfortunes. One day, Mary openly said, "I can't tolerate this influence anymore. Rob is harming you, he's destroying us, and you don't even see it." Her words hit me hard, but I still defended Rob. I couldn't accept the idea that someone I had been through so much with could be the source of my pain. It felt like betrayal. Realizing that someone you consider a friend might actually be hurting you is incredibly difficult. My internal struggle only intensified. On one hand, I felt that something was wrong, that Rob was somehow affecting me, but on the other hand, I continued to blindly trust him. His voice became a sort of guide for me, even though it always led me somewhere I didn't want to be. I began losing myself, my values, and even my goals. Everything that used to matter lost its meaning. Rob also started suggesting more and more risky ventures. He was always the one looking for quick money, and constantly found dubious projects that promised big profits. I kept agreeing, thinking that any moment now things would finally improve. But every time these deals ended in failure or small losses that gradually piled up, turning into significant debts. I began to realize that Rob might not even be aware of how much he was dragging me down. The deeper I sank into this chaos, the more I understood that I was losing control over my life. My heart pounded with anxiety, and my mind was constantly filled with thoughts of how to fix all these mistakes. I was trapped between the desire to save what was left of my life and the feeling that I was already too deep in this mess. Rob kept pushing me into new schemes, and despite my fear, I kept following him. At some point, I realized that my self-esteem was completely shattered. I no longer saw myself as someone capable of making the right decisions. Every move I made ended in failure, and I didn't know if it was even worth trying to change anything. I felt like I was stuck in a vicious cycle with no way out. My once confident self had turned into a shadow, and that scared me more than any other problem. During this time, my fear of being alone became even more palpable. I started fearing that I would lose not only my job and family, but also myself. I stopped trusting my instincts, my decisions, and even my emotions. Every attempt to fix the situation only led to more problems. My soul was torn apart, and I couldn't see a way out. Mary continued to drift further away from me. She was tired of the constant conflicts and the tension that hung over our home. Her eyes often expressed sadness and disappointment, and I felt guilty for not being able to change things. I could see her suffering, but I couldn't find a solution to save our relationship. Rob, who once seemed like my only support, had now become the one who was destroying everything that mattered to me. The more I tried to justify my actions, the more I realized that I kept making the same mistakes. I was trapped in my own fears and insecurities. Rob seemed to push me towards success, but every time I followed his advice, it ended in yet another failure. I started losing not just money, but also my future. Everything I had built over years of hard work was disappearing before my eyes. My colleagues at work began to notice changes in my behavior. I became more withdrawn, often missing meetings or showing up unprepared. This only worsened my position in the team, and I felt like I was gradually being excluded from important projects. Once, I was a reliable and confident employee, but that was now in the past. My fears and doubts prevented me from acting with certainty. One day, after yet another failure at work, I met with Carol. She had a serious talk with me, warning that if things didn't change, my position at the company would be at risk. Her words were like a slap in the face. I realized that I had lost everything that mattered to me professionally. Every attempt to defend myself only made the situation worse. Carol no longer trusted me, and that hurt the most. Mary kept insisting that I needed to distance myself from Rob, but I was too weak to make that decision. I felt like I was trapped. If I cut ties with Rob, I'd lose support and a part of my life that once meant so much to me. But at the same time, I could see that this friendship was slowly destroying me. I was at a crossroads where both paths seemed wrong. I started reflecting more on my mistakes. All these years, I followed Rob, believing that his advice would lead me to success. But now I saw that it was an illusion. Every piece of advice from him led to new problems, and I began to realize that I was responsible for my own failures. But understanding this didn't help me find a solution. I was confused and felt helpless. The more I tried to fix the situation, the more it spiraled out of control. I lost trust in myself and my instincts. Everything that once seemed clear and straightforward now felt distant and unreachable. My self-esteem was shattered, and I couldn't see a way to rebuild it. Rob remained by my side, but now I could see that his presence only deepened my problems. The feeling of loneliness became my constant companion. I was surrounded by people, yet I felt isolated. It seemed like no one could understand what I was going through. I was surrounded by walls I had built myself, and I didn't know how to break them down. Each new day became another challenge, and I no longer believed that I could find a way out. My dependency on Rob was like a vicious cycle. Every time I decided that something needed to change, I'd turn to him for advice again, and it only made my problems worse. I started doubting my ability to make decisions on my own. My inner voice was drowned out by doubts and fear of making a mistake. It was a true nightmare, with no way out in sight. One evening, I realized that I had reached a breaking point. I could no longer continue living the way I had been. I was faced with a choice. Either I break free from this chaos, or I let it completely destroy me. But taking that step was terrifying. I was afraid that if I severed ties with Rob, I'd be left without support and fall into even deeper despair. This internal struggle went on for a long time. Every day became a new test for me, and I didn't know if I would ever find a way out. My dreams and plans had crumbled to pieces, leaving me alone with my fears and doubts. It felt like I no longer had control over my life, and that was the scariest part. I always thought I could find a balance between trusting Rob and relying on my own common sense. But when we got involved in another business deal, I realized that the situation was finally spiraling out of control. Rob proposed a scheme that, according to him, would bring substantial profits. He assured me that this was our chance to fix all our past failures, restore our reputation, and reach a new level. I was exhausted from constant setbacks and wanted to believe that this time things would be different. However, deep down, I felt that this could be another disaster. We agreed on a deal that required significant investment. Rob assured me that all the details were thought out and risks were minimal. He convinced me to take out a loan and invest in the project, promising that we would quickly recoup the money with interest. I hesitated, but I felt pressured. This was a chance not only for both of us, but also for my future. Besides, I was already at a point where it seemed like I had lost everything there was to lose. So I agreed, hoping that this time we could break free from the vicious cycle of failures. The first few weeks seemed promising. Rob had a knack for creating the illusion of success. He set up meetings, signed contracts, and on the surface, everything looked professional. But inside, my anxiety grew. Something kept gnawing at me, a feeling that this deal was just a temporary illusion that could collapse at any moment. I tried to control the situation, but the more I dug into the details, the more I realized that I didn't actually understand anything. Rob always appeared confident, convincing me that everything was going according to plan, but I could see cracks in this perfect picture. The climax came when it turned out that we had overlooked an important legal aspect of the deal. One of the partners on whom we had placed high hopes suddenly backed out, and our entire scheme began to crumble like a house of cards. It was a blow from which I couldn't recover. I was left owing a large sum of money, and my financial stability was at risk. But even worse was the fact that my reputation at work was completely destroyed. My boss, Carol, had yet another reason to doubt my abilities, and I realized that I no longer had a future at this company. All of this marked the beginning of the end. Mary found out about the failure and was devastated. She had been warning me for a long time that Rob was leading us to disaster, but I stubbornly refused to acknowledge it. We had a long conversation during which she openly said that she could no longer live in constant fear and tension. She insisted that I cut ties with Rob, or else our lives would descend into complete chaos. I felt her words hit me to the core, yet I couldn't bring myself to end the friendship. I was torn by guilt. I knew Mary was right, but at the same time, I felt that I would be betraying myself if I abandoned Rob. After all, he was the one who had supported me during the toughest times of my life. In my memories, I often went back to the times when we were young and faced challenges together. I remembered how Rob helped me get back on my feet when I lost my job a few years ago. He was there when I didn't know how to handle my problems, and it was during that time that I felt this friendship was the only thing I could rely on. But now, everything had changed. I could see how our relationship had turned into something toxic. Rob was no longer the friend I once knew. His advice was filled with risk and danger, and every step he took dragged me down. I knew he was manipulating me, yet I couldn't break free from this dependency. It felt like a trap I couldn't escape. I was so deeply entangled in this chaos that I no longer knew where I ended and Rob's influence began. My environment had become toxic, and I was fully aware of it. Mary was drifting further away from me, and I could see the fear and disappointment in her eyes. She no longer believed that I could turn the situation around. The tension at home was constant, and every conversation we had ended in an argument. She couldn't understand why I was so attached to someone who was only harming us, and I couldn't find an answer to that question. Maybe I was afraid of facing my problems alone, without the support that, even though flawed, was still there. I started to feel like my mind was falling apart. Every day felt like a struggle for survival. I could no longer focus on work, not even on simple tasks. My thoughts constantly returned to what had happened. I could feel my mental state breaking under the weight of all these problems. Every attempt to find a solution ended in failure, and I no longer saw a way out of this maze. I started having trouble sleeping, often waking up in the middle of the night, replaying in my mind what had gone wrong and how things could have been different. Flashbacks became a part of my daily life. I kept reminiscing about the times when everything was simpler. I saw vivid images of our younger days, how Rob and I had fun together, how we supported each other in tough situations. Those memories warmed my heart, but also deepened the sense of loss. I no longer recognized the Rob I once knew. Now, he was more a source of pain than support. But breaking this bond was incredibly difficult. My colleagues at work had completely lost faith in me. I became an outcast in the team, and any suggestion I made was met with suspicion. Several times, I tried proposing new ideas to prove my professional worth, but each time I faced a wall of indifference or outright distrust. It was humiliating, knowing that I had once been an essential part of this team, but now I felt utterly irrelevant. The worst part was realizing that I had put myself in this position. Every decision I made under Rob's influence gradually destroyed everything I had built. I watched as my life crumbled into pieces, feeling utterly helpless. I no longer controlled anything, not even my own thoughts. I sank into depression and saw no light at the end of the tunnel. Mary tried to support me, but I could see that her patience was wearing thin. She gave me an ultimatum. Either I change something in my life, or she's leaving. Those words hit me hard, but at the same time, I knew I couldn't just let go of my friendship with Rob. He had been a part of my life for so long that I couldn't imagine living without him. I felt trapped between two things that were both important to me, and no decision seemed right. I tried to find some justification for my actions. I convinced myself that Rob wasn't to blame for everything that was happening. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe my problems were the result of my own mistakes, not his influence. But the more I tried to justify him, the more I realized how destructive that influence had become. I understood that I was dependent on his opinion and afraid of losing that support, even if it was harmful. Each day, I became more aware that I couldn't get out of this without making radical changes. But taking that step was terrifying. I was scared of being alone without the person who had been a part of my life for so long. Even when someone is hurting you, it's hard to let go. I was confused and paralyzed by fear of the future. I didn't know what my life would look like without Rob, and that uncertainty frightened me more than anything else. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had lost myself. I was no longer the person I used to be. My ambitions, dreams, and plans had dissolved in endless attempts to please Rob and follow his advice. I realized that I was living his life, not mine. And that realization hit me like a punch in the gut. I was no longer in control of my life, and that scared me to my core. One evening, I sat in the kitchen staring at my cup of coffee, thinking about what to do next. Mary was in her room, and I felt an insurmountable wall growing between us. I knew that if I didn't act soon, I would lose her. But I also understood that to save our relationship, I would have to cut ties with Rob. And that decision was the hardest one of my life. I hesitated, doubted, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. The next day, I decided to talk to Rob. I knew it would be a difficult conversation, but I couldn't put it off any longer. We met at a cafe where we usually discussed our plans. I was nervous, but ready to take this step. Rob, as usual, looked confident and calm. He started talking about a new opportunity he had found, but I wasn't listening anymore. I knew this moment would decide everything. I gathered my thoughts and told him that I could no longer follow his advice, that this friendship, which once meant so much to me, had now become a source of pain and problems. Rob looked surprised, even offended. He started making excuses, saying I was mistaken, that he had always just wanted to help. But I could see his confidence beginning to fade. He realized that he was losing control over me. The conversation was tough. I felt like I was being torn apart inside, but I knew it was the only way to save myself and my life. Rob tried to convince me that we could still fix things, that it wasn't worth giving up on everything. But I stood firm in my decision. I said I no longer wanted to be part of his schemes and manipulations, that this friendship had become a burden I could no longer bear. After our conversation, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders, but at the same time, there was an emptiness inside me. I knew I had made the right choice, but it hurt. I wasn't just losing a friend, I was losing a part of my past, my memories. But I also knew it was a necessary step if I wanted to regain control of my life. Now I faced the daunting task of rebuilding everything that was destroyed over the years. My career, my relationship with Mary, my self-esteem, everything needs serious work. But I'm ready for it. I know the path won't be easy, but now I have the motivation. I won't let anyone else control my life and make decisions for me anymore. This is my fight, and I'm ready to take it on. It seems like life often tests us at the most unexpected moments. I thought I had already hit rock bottom when I failed my last business deal with Rob and was left owing a substantial amount of money. However, I had no idea how deep this abyss could go. As it turned out, everything that had happened before was just the beginning of a real nightmare. The worst was yet to come when I discovered that Rob wasn't just dragging me into his risky schemes. He had involved me in something much more serious. One day, I received a letter summoning me to a legal consultation. I was confused, as I hadn't signed any deals or contracts recently. When I read the letter to the end, a chill ran down my spine. The document stated that my name was mentioned in an investigation involving financial fraud. At first, I thought it was a mistake or even a prank. But when I received a second summons, I realized the matter was far more serious. My first thoughts were about Rob. I understood that this was somehow connected to him, since all my recent business contacts and financial deals had been handled through him. Everything fell into place when I consulted a lawyer. It turned out that Rob had been using my name as a trusted party in several of his schemes, and now I was responsible for all these frauds. He had listed me as his partner, involving me in signing documents without my knowledge. This was a real stab in the back. Panic gripped me. For years, I had blindly trusted Rob, believing that while he was prone to taking risks, he still operated within the law. But now it was clear that he had been using me as a front for his shady dealings. My reputation was on the line, and the worst part was that I could lose everything: my job, my home, even my freedom. This was no longer just about financial losses or failed deals. It was a genuine legal problem that could end in a court case and severe consequences. When I tried to contact Rob, he, as usual, tried to downplay the situation. "Don't worry, it's just a formality, and we'll sort it out quickly," he said in his usual carefree tone. But this time I could no longer believe his words. Inside me, anger boiled, mixed with a sense of betrayal. How could he do this to me? The person I considered my friend had put me on the brink of disaster. This was something I could no longer forgive. This moment became a turning point in my life. I realized that I could no longer ignore the obvious. All of Mary's previous warnings, all my internal doubts, they all now formed a clear picture. Rob had never been a true friend. He had been using me for his own purposes by hiding his shady schemes behind my name. This wasn't just a coincidence or a series of unfortunate events. It was deliberate manipulation designed to drag me into his dangerous games. When Mary found out about the situation, she was shocked. She couldn't believe things had gone this far. Once again, she emphasized that I needed to cut all ties with Rob, and this time I couldn't argue. Inside, a fierce battle raged between the desire to hold on to the remnants of our past friendship and the need to free myself from this toxic relationship. After I finally severed ties with Rob, my life began to gradually fall into place. It was a difficult decision that cost me a lot of inner turmoil, but now I could see it was the only right step. At first, I felt a sense of emptiness, as Rob had been part of my life for so many years. However, over time, I realized that this break was necessary for my own well-being, both physical and mental. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was regaining control of my life. Rebuilding relationships at work became one of my first priorities. I knew I needed to restore the trust of my colleagues and, most importantly, my boss, Carol. She had once considered me a promising employee, but due to my previous mistakes and decisions, her trust had been undermined. Initially, our conversations were tense, as she remembered how stubbornly I had insisted on risky projects that ended in failure. But instead of making excuses, I decided to be honest and take responsibility for my mistakes. I admitted that I had been influenced by Rob and made choices based on his provocations rather than sound judgment. It was difficult, as acknowledging one's weaknesses is always painful, but Carol appreciated my honesty. She gave me a chance to prove that I could rectify the situation and regain my reputation. It took several months of hard work to show that I could once again be the leader she had once seen in me. Gradually, colleagues began to trust me more, and I felt part of the team once again. Changes for the better also came at home. Mary saw that I was serious about changing my life and putting things right. Our relationship, which had been on the brink of collapse, began to recover. She was patient, but also persistent in working through our issues together. We started spending more time together, openly discussing what troubled us, and this became the foundation for rebuilding trust. I realized that true support comes not from those who push for risky moves, but from those who help find balance and maintain stability in life. Over time, I began to see how everything that was once shattered was gradually being restored. But the greatest lesson I learned from this experience left a deep mark on my heart. Sometimes, people we consider close to us can actually be the main cause of our problems. They may mask their true intentions under the guise of friendship and support, but ultimately their presence only destroys our lives. Rob was not just a toxic friend. He became the catalyst for all my failures and problems. This experience taught me an important lesson. Friendship should not cost you your own life, peace, and health. Sometimes you need to be able to let go of even those with whom you have years of memories if the relationship is more harmful than beneficial. Now, I clearly distinguish between those who truly deserve my trust and those who only use me for their own purposes. And this understanding has helped me build healthier relationships both at work and in my personal life. Looking back, I see that I was blind to many red flags in Rob's behavior. His desire to control my decisions and constantly push me toward risks was obvious, but I didn't want to see it. I felt a deep sense of guilt for allowing him to influence my life so much. However, I also understand that this experience was necessary for my personal growth. I have become stronger and wiser, and now I clearly know where the boundaries lie between support and manipulation. After everything that happened, I began to value people who genuinely want the best for me. My true friends stayed by my side even when I was at rock bottom. They didn't try to push me toward risky moves. Instead, they helped me find stability and peace. I also started to listen more to myself and my instincts. Now I know that it's worth trusting my inner voice more than blindly following others' advice, even if it seems wise at first glance. My experience showed that sometimes the hardest thing is to acknowledge that you're in a toxic relationship and that it needs to end. It can be painful, frightening, and even lonely, but in the long run, it's the only way to break free from a vicious cycle and regain control of your life. I was dependent on Rob, but now I see that this dependency was merely an illusion of support. It was actually destroying me, taking away my strength and confidence. By ending that relationship, I was finally able to start rebuilding my life without the constant feeling of fear and anxiety. Yes, it was tough, but now I feel like I'm returning to who I was before all these problems. I have learned to value peace and stability rather than chasing after elusive successes that promise quick money or temporary satisfaction. My marriage has also become stronger. Mary supported me through the toughest times, and now we are working together to restore harmony in our family. We no longer allow outsiders to interfere in our lives or influence our decisions. We've learned to communicate openly about our feelings and not be afraid to admit when something isn't right. I'm grateful for her patience and belief that I could change. It was a long and difficult road, but we walked it together. After everything I've been through, I've become more cautious about whom I let into my life. I now know that friendship isn't just about shared memories or fun times together. It's about mutual support, trust, and respect for personal boundaries. If a person doesn't respect your decisions, constantly criticizes you, or forces you to do things that make you uncomfortable, that friendship is doomed to fail. Even if it's hard to realize at first, eventually you have to choose your own well-being. My experience may be instructive for those currently going through something similar. Sometimes we hold on too long to what actually harms us because we fear change or loss. But the truth is that losing a toxic person is not a defeat, but a victory over yourself and your fears. I no longer feel guilty for choosing my own well-being over a false friendship. It was a difficult but necessary decision, and now I see that it has brought only positive changes to my life. I hope my story helps someone make the right choice. Life is too short to let others drag you down. If you're in a similar situation, remember, you always have the right to choose what's best for you. Sometimes you need to let go of the past to build a better future, and that's not weakness, but strength. The strength to make decisions for your own happiness and peace. Have you experienced similar situations with friends who only dragged you down? Share your experiences in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories.